What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown. This is the Heresy Financial Show, and today I've got a fantastic guest on the show for you today, Per Bylund. He is one of my favorite modern-day Austrian economists. He is the assistant professor of entrepreneurship and Records Johnston Professor of Free Enterprise in the School of Entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University. On top of that, he is the author of fantastic books like this one, The Seen, The Unseen, and The Unrealized. Link below. Per, thank you so much for joining us today. Well, Per, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Hey, thanks for having me. This will be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, here's what I would like to do. Number one, I've talked about the topics and the themes in your book, The Seen, The Unseen, and The Unrealized. I've got that linked in the description below in tons of my videos on this channel. So I'm really excited to kind of get a breakdown and go through these pieces systematically. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to give a very high level overview, just a crude, almost caricature of what we're going to talk about. You can correct me anything that I misspoke on, and then we'll go through it piece by piece. Does that sound all right?
That sounds great. Let's do it.
So in my understanding of this, we start off with the scene, and that's the classic example of this is the broken window. Some kid breaks my window. I have to go replace my window. Then the window seller gets a nice little extra payday. Everybody looks at that and says, that's what we can see. So it's good because that's economic activity. And then you take it one step further. Well, first of all, that's modern economics. That's where the Keynesians like to stop, and that's what everybody can, because it's easy. Take one step further, though, and you get to the unseen, which is I was going to go buy a new pair of shoes, but now I can't do that. And so net society is down one window. There's less wealth than there was before because the window was broken and had to be replaced. I couldn't spend the money on the shoes, and then all the downstream effects from there. That's typically understood by most people as well if they do any critical thought. The next piece, though, we move into a couple things: value, regulation, and unrealized, which is the big piece here that we'll get to at the end. Value, it's ordinal, it's subjective, and people left to their free choices will pursue actions that maximize their value based on their own subjective wants and needs. And regulation comes in, which is the express purpose of regulation is to change behavior. You don't have to have a law that says people need to sleep at night, because for the most part, people sleep during the night, right? So laws change behaviors. And so when you have something come in and artificially change behaviors, now you have that value ranking is no longer able to be sought after. Maybe the first thing or the second thing, you can't pursue that anymore. So regulations come in and by definition, change behavior into something that is less valuable than what would have happened naturally. But the real key here we'll get into is the unrealized, which is the downstream effects of all that, because wealth is evolutionary and cumulative and builds on itself. And that's the real piece here. So did I give an all right caricature of this?
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I think that summarizes it really well.
Okay, well, perfect. Let's break this down then, go through it piece by piece. Let's talk about this scene more in detail, because it's such it seems so obvious to many that it's a fallacy, the broken window fallacy. What is it about it that keeps on attracting monetary policy and fiscal policy and modern economists to try and pursue actions that kind of look like they fit into this broken window fallacy?
Well, I think, at the very core is simply that it's data. So we can measure it, we can see it, and since we can observe it, that's what's going on. And of course, we can't know really what would have happened if this was not the real world, right? So anything else would sort of be a, not hypothesis, but maybe even a fantasy or imagined, so it's not really real. And we see this a lot with people comparing. Say, the minimum wage is a standard example, right? That where they raise the minimum wage and they see people are not unemployed to a greater extent than before, so obviously it worked, and now the average wage is much higher than it used to be, so economic theory is wrong. And how do you argue against that? Well, you would have to start by simply saying, well, you can't really compare before and after, because you should compare after the policy with what after would have been like without the policy, right? Because there are so many things that are changing in the economy.
Right.
And that really makes it really complex, and it seems that it's really unreliable as well, right? I mean, you're practically guessing what the world would be like. So economists who are empirical economists, they try to solve this problem by producing a counterfactual. So they might look at two different states, for instance, one that imposes a minimum wage and one that does not, but is similar. Or they might construct a combination of other states with certain weights that sort of fits with the state that imposed this minimum wage, but they don't have the minimum wage. And then you can sort of make up this example that seems to fit the historical data, and then you just assume that this would continue into the future. But it's still based on a lot of assumptions, right? So it's still data, which we are taught in school and on TV and everywhere, that data are hard. It's the natural sciences, right? It's physics. You can travel to the moon, that sort of thing. In the social sciences, no one is going to use social sciences to travel to the moon. It's not going to happen, right? So it's fuzzy. It's a little soft. It's not the hard sciences. Whereas I would argue that it's actually the other way around. Right? I would say that there are the social sciences and there are the simple sciences. The social sciences are much more complex, but that also has a method that is much more reliable. But I mean, we might get to that later.
So you talk about this in your book a little bit in terms of ineffective versus effective regulation, because if they come out and they say, hey, the minimum wage is going to go from $7 to $8 an hour, but 99% of people are already making over $10 an hour, that's an ineffective regulation because it doesn't change any behavior, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we can regulate anything we want and put it at such a level that it's not going to affect anything. Well, then regulations have no effect. But the whole point of regulations is to cause some change in behavior or get rid of some phenomenon or something like that, right? So we tax alcohol and tobacco really highly because then people will use less of it because we think it's unhealthy and politicians don't want us to drink and smoke, right? But sure, they could impose a tax of zero and say, yay, it's zero tax on, but we're still imposing it. Well, it's not going to change anybody's behavior. People are going to drink and smoke just as much. And the same thing with, I mean, prohibiting anything or adding a cost to something or saying that, just like you said with the minimum wage, that, oh, everybody needs to pay at least $2 an hour. Well, no one pays less than that, so it doesn't affect anything at all. What you're trying to do is to change how the world looks and what the world is like, what it looks like, right? So you would need to say that, well, let's impose a minimum wage at a level higher than people actually have, so that we don't have any low-paying jobs anymore. That's the whole point, right? And then we can argue, okay, what are the real effects of this? Because what the minimum wage does is not provide extra salary to people. It doesn't pay people extra. The only thing it says is that you cannot hire anyone unless you pay them this much, right? It's a prohibition. So you can set it at 15, as people are claiming they should have now, right? But if you want people to get rich and if this actually works, why not set the minimum wage at $50 or $5,000 an hour? Then they would make a lot of money, right? If it just means that wages go up, then go ahead. So the real analysis of it is, what are the actual effects of this? If we impose this thing and it's effective, then it has some effect. What effect is it? And that's what economists need to answer and do it well, right? Do it in the right way.
Right. Yeah, because the seen effects of, let's say, this minimum wage example, they're very relatively easy to collect this data on, because you've got all the employment data, you've got the wages, and so you can look and you can say all these people were making $7 an hour, now they're making $10 or $15 an hour, whatever it is. It's a lot harder to look at that and say, of all of these people that got that raise, they're working this many hours less than compared to before. It's harder to say there are fewer hiring decisions made because that's one of those things that's not seen. And there is no data because it's by definition a lack of data of something like, hey, they didn't hire this person because whereas they would have before potentially.
Right, and that's the problem that we're struggling with in entrepreneurship too. We can't really study failures because they're not there anymore. Right, we can only study successes, and it's the same thing with minimum wages. If we say, well, imagine we impose a minimum wage of $50, and then after we impose this minimum wage, we go out and we look at the statistics and we collect all this data and we look at, okay, so how much are people actually making? We're not going to find anyone who makes less than $50 because we just imposed that rule, right? But what else happens and what did not happen, especially that did not happen, right? That's what is important. How many startups are we not seeing because there's no way in hell that they can pay $50 an hour while they're trying to figure out their value proposition, right? There's simply no way. And usually they have interns, and I mean the entrepreneur, him or herself, is working for free. Maybe the whole entrepreneurial team is working for free because they can't afford paying wages at all. And then they have to make a hire because they need someone to do something specific that they can't do, or they need more people to work simply. Well, at $50 an hour, they probably can't do that. So the startup either doesn't grow or doesn't take off, or maybe they don't even start it because it's no point, right? How do you capture that, the startup that never happened? It's not in the data, obviously, right? Because the data can't study or observe anything. It can't record anything that didn't happen.
What are some things that you look around today and say, hey, here are some really good examples of things that that have big seen results, but are potentially causing large unseen bad negative consequences?
Well, a lot of these things, right? And the problem is that there are so many regulations that when you start looking at this, you go, "Oh my goodness, what what is going on in this world?" Because most of what we're seeing is totally inefficient and just madness. We see a lot of these phenomena that, and I mean, types of businesses, industries that take off and become really big, and you start asking why, and they look, well, wait a minute, because of all these regulations, we probably wouldn't have seen this because consumers are not actually all that interested in this, right? But they would have chosen something else if something else had been there, right? And I mean, there are plenty of these examples of regulations, just regulations that are really burdensome and costly and that change things. I mean, you have like the Jones Act here in the U.S., where in order to transport something from one port to the other, if the ports are in the U.S., both of them, you have to use a ship that's flagged in the U.S., that is built in the U.S., I think, and has a U.S. crew. Which means if you're transporting something from California to Hawaii, very often it's cheaper to go to Japan and then back to Hawaii. Because then you can use a ship that is owned by someone somewhere else, and you have a foreign crew and whatnot else, right? So very often, then you're seeing these. If you're looking at the trade routes today, you'll see that why are they doing all this crazy stuff? I mean, why are they from California transporting just a lot of stuff that goes to Hawaii, but some of it is going to Japan. So they're going to Japan first and then back to Hawaii. Why not stop in Hawaii and then go to Japan? Well, the reason is because you need to stop at an international harbor first in order to go to Hawaii, because otherwise you're violating the Jones Act. And there are many of these things when you just start looking at what is actually going on, you go, why in the world? Because it doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make no sense whatsoever to ship things to Hawaii via Japan. But that still happens.
Right. Another example of this I saw recently is Vans shoes. They put felt on, I think, 60% of the bottom of the sole because then legally it's classified as a slipper, not a shoe, and there's much lower tariff on importing slippers versus shoes. And so you have this, massive somebody in the felt industry did a good job lobbying to get this specific rule passed there, because now there's a big misallocation of resources at the very least to put money into felt bottom shoes, whereas that would not happen otherwise.
Yeah, and we see these examples everywhere, right? So you see in around the Mediterranean, you're going to see a lot of houses that are not fully built. So it looks like they just stopped, and the top story is never completed. So you just have these pieces of metal sticking out of the what should be the ceiling or the roof and stuff like that. And why is that? Because they need to pay taxes at completion. So if they never complete the house, then they don't have to pay that tax, right? And the same thing you saw earlier anyway in Sweden, where your tax rate for a property would go up if you had bathrooms that were fully tiled, which meant the tile went from floor to ceiling, which meant everybody stopped a number of inches from the ceiling, so they didn't put tiles all the way up, right? And if you see it and you're used to it, you don't ask the question. But if you see it as a foreigner, for instance, going to Sweden, like, why didn't you put the tile all the way up? I mean, is there some weird design? Everybody has this. Why is that the case? Well, it's because of tax reasons. We would like to have tile all the way, but we're not putting tile all the way because it's so darn costly because of the tax rules. So everybody's always just trying to avoid this extra cost, because at some point it gets too costly. It's simply not worth it, right? And then you change your behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so with the seen and the unseen here, let's move into value, because this is something I think one of the most misunderstood things. Even a lot of people who love free markets and want less regulation talk about things, intrinsic value and objective value and things like that. Can you give an explanation of how value is ordinal and subjective, and how consumers go about creating wealth and creating value based on that type of ranking?
Sure. And I mean, value in economics, the basic foundation or the assumption in economics is that value is subjective. And part of that is simply that we can't explain it. We don't know exactly what people value or why they value it. And it doesn't really matter. We know that they do value something, and that their actions are striving to achieve some value, something that they value personally. It can be completely nuts to the rest of us, or it could be completely understandable. But it doesn't matter, because they still act in order to achieve it, right? And then the question is, okay, so how does that help us explain what they're doing? Well, it's obvious if you think about it that if you're valuing, say, water in specific units. So if you're in the desert and you get a glass of water, it's worth a lot to you. Well, the second glass of water might still be worth a lot if you're in the desert, but if at some point when you have enough glass of water, you don't really have a use for them anymore, right? Well, then the question is, okay, so how do you value those glasses of water that you do have a use for? Well, if you consider the glasses of water basically have the same function to you, then you're going to use the first one to satisfy the greatest want that you have. You're going to get as much value as possible out of that glass of water. If you get a second one, well, then you're going to satisfy that want that is still unsatisfied, that you can't satisfy with the glass of water. And if you get a third one, you're going to satisfy the remaining highest one, right? So it's always going to be a lower and lower value that you satisfy with the good that you buy, right? And there's an example in Bombavark from, it's the late 19th century. And it's still an example that I use in my teaching because it's so beautiful. It's about this colonial farmer who's living alone, and he has these sacks of corn that he can use for different things. And according to his own valuation, where it comes from, we need to care about that, right? But he would use, if he had one sack of corn, he would use it just for sustenance to survive. If he had a second one, he would eat that one too, but then it would be sort of healthy and strong. If he had a third one, then he would feed poultry. If he had a fourth one, he would make coarse spirits, as Bombari puts it. And if he had a fifth bag of corn, then he would feed parrots, because then he wouldn't be as lonely anymore, or whatever, right? And that's how he values those things. And we can sort of understand his ranking. It makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, survival, then health, then some bird meat, and then liquor. I mean, maybe you want to put liquor higher up on your list, but I mean, it doesn't really matter. But then the question is, okay, so what happens if he has 4 and he gets to buy a 5th one? How much is he willing to pay for that 5th one? Well, he's not willing to pay the value of any of those ones that he has satisfied. He's willing to pay less than the value he gets out of using it, right? And the same thing, if he loses one of those 4, he's going to lose the lowest of those 4 ones that he satisfies. And since the sacks of corn they're the same to him, they have the same function. Even if he would mark them like A, B, C, D, and he would use them for survival, for health, for poultry, and for coarse spirits, if he would lose the one A that is dedicated for just eating for health, that doesn't mean that he's gonna die but he's gonna have coarse spirits. Of course not. He's gonna rearrange them, right? He's still gonna use the 3 that he has towards the highest value that he can. And we all act in this matter, right? Because it's our own valuation. Which means the more we have of something, the lower the value of each unit, because it goes down our ranking. And that is how we buy things, right? Because we have money is simply purchasing power. And we go into a store and we say, okay, how can I get as much value as possible for my money? And it might be that you buy one big good that costs a lot. It might be buying several smaller things that satisfy tiny wants, but combined you think that satisfies a lot more wants for you, so it's more valuable. Or it could mean that you buy just the same thing, but multiple items of the same thing, because maybe that is highest on your ranking. Right? And really your ranking of values this way is really your demand curve for all these goods.
And it also highlights, like your example of walking into the store and choosing, maximizing your value with your purchasing power. It highlights the fact that it really is subjective, because when you engage in that transaction, you're creating more value for yourself. You would rather have the milk and the meat and the beans and whatever you buy. You would rather have that than the money, but the store would rather have the money than that stuff. So in this way, both parties are profiting. They're both increasing the value that they have by participating in that exchange.
Right, exactly. And this is also a point that I usually make, is that you go through this trade because both parties expect to be better off, right? Both parties value what the other is giving up and giving them more than what they are themselves giving up, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't go through with it. It doesn't make any sense. But this has this very fundamental point really has a lesson for businesses that I think most businesses are simply not considering. That if you buy a good, if I buy something from you for $100, I value the good higher than the $100. Well, if the good doesn't work, and I want to return it, and you say, oh, no, sorry, I don't have any more, but I'll make you whole and I'll give you back your $100, you're still at a loss, right? Because you get the $100 back, but you were willing to give the $100 for the product. So you're not actually made whole by getting all the money back, right? You're not losing from the original position, but you expected to get more because you wanted the product, right? So even the money back guarantee is only if you make a mistake in buying something and it turns out that, it wasn't as valuable as I thought. But if you actually still want the product and it doesn't work, and the company cannot replace the product, and they offer you money back and a full refund, the full refund sets you back from where you wanted to be. right? So it still does not.
And when you take into account the time spent on going through that ordeal just to get back to the position you were at before, you actually are at a slight negative taking into account that time.
Right. Yeah, that too. And you're already at a negative, even if you don't take the time and effort into account, right? Because you wanted the good more than you wanted the $100. So that difference is lost. So you're at a worse position than you wanted to be, and you're going to have to put in this effort and time to get the refund. So in a sense, the business, I mean, inadvertently, but is harming the consumer without thinking that they are harming the consumer. They're thinking in terms of, as you often do, that the price is the value, right? But that is not the case.
Yeah.
It is not the value. The value, the good is worth paying the price because we think the good is more valuable than the price.
So the lesson in value, before we move on to regulation, the lesson in value is that even though both parties are seeking to maximize their own wealth by freely participating in exchange, that doesn't necessarily mean they are correct, because mistakes can be made. However, it does mean that by everybody freely having the ability to list their own values subjectively and engage in exchange to try and maximize their own value, it allows for the most value creation possible because everybody's engaging in their own interests to maximize their own value.
Exactly. I mean, there are always going to be mistakes, just like you said, and people might not know anything about the product they're buying, or they might have ideas that are simply not true, or whatnot else. I mean, uncertainty is involved too, but they're always trying to pursue, and they're always trying to maximize their wants, right? They maximize the value they're getting, and we're all acting in that way, given the products and services available to us, of course. Right, so given that situation, given the market situation, which is why the market is so glorious in a sense, right? Because it offers us all these alternatives, and then we as consumers get to use our purchasing power to pick all those things that we want out of these gazillion different products, and thereby we can much easier satisfy our wants, and we can be much better off by simply choosing from all these products.
Okay, so that's value. Moving into regulation, let's talk about number one, what regulation is, and then number two, how does that impact the kind of the value creation, people seeking to maximize value in free exchange.
Right. So we already talked about how regulation needs to be effective, or it doesn't really matter. Right. So the only way regulation can be effective is to keep you from, or basically prohibiting certain choices. So it will either make certain choices too more costly by imposing a tax, or it will simply be a prohibition saying that you cannot, like is typically the case with drugs, right? You're not allowed to do drugs. Okay, end of story. So it still means that you can do drugs because people are doing it. We all know that, but it comes with a severe penalty if you do, and if you get caught, right? Which means that many people might not pursue it. It might be too costly. They might not want to try it anymore. And of course, this goes with anything. So, for instance, there was a regulation before in many countries that you could not do research on nuclear power. And why? Well, simply because we don't want nuclear bombs. Well, I mean, obviously, if you can't do research on nuclear power, you also cannot produce very effective nuclear power plants. So we would not get those power plants. That would be the outcome of it. And to the extent that those regulations were effective, we would simply not get those better power plants. And instead we get Fukushima. Who knows, right? It's hard to say. That's probably not what they expected with that sort of regulation, but that's what we got, right? So regulations affect people's choices. It stops you from pursuing and attaining some valued end that you have on your list that you otherwise would try to pursue, right? Because otherwise, that one is lost to you, and therefore you change your behavior. So any effective regulation would necessarily take some of these options away from you, or make them way too costly, or make them simply impossible. So what this means then is that you would choose probably something else. I mean, if you have money and you go to the store and you want to buy something and they're out of it, you still might need dinner, so you might buy something else. But you're not gonna buy what's at the top of your list because that's why you went to the store, and you can't buy that anymore. So you're gonna buy something else. It's not as funny. It's not maybe not as tasty. You wouldn't have chosen this if they had whatever it is that you went there to buy, right? So you're gonna pick something that's lower on your list. And the same thing with regulation. That if a regulation is making one of those options too costly or even impossible that you otherwise would have pursued, you're pursuing something else instead. So you're pursuing something that to you is of lesser value by necessity, because you would not have chosen it had you had the other options, right? So this is, of course, is the case for any regulation that is effective. That people choose different things, or maybe they might choose not to pursue an end at all, right? I mean, sometimes we choose to buy something, and if you can't buy that, then you're just going to put the money in your bank account, or you wait till tomorrow, or whatever it might be, right? But you're going to choose something that you would not have chosen otherwise, and that because you would not have chosen it otherwise, it's necessarily of lower value to you, which of course makes you poorer, right? That's what it means. You cannot satisfy those highly valued wants that you have. You're gonna have to go for something that is of lesser value to you. Still the same purchasing power, perhaps, and everything, but you're gonna lose the difference between what you would have chosen and what you can't choose.
So I'll recap just to make sure I have this down, and then I would like to present kind of a challenge, what I think would be the counterpoint to that argument. Humans will, by definition, pursue activities and actions that will maximize their own wealth, maximize their own values, based on the fact that it's all subjective. Value is subjective. So every action I'm taking is done in the effort to maximize my own wealth and value creation. And by any regulation entering the picture, the only thing regulation does is change behavior that would have happened otherwise, if it's effective. And so if it does change behavior, that means by definition it is changing my behavior from one action to a different behavior that is by definition of lower value to me, making me therefore worse off, poorer than I would be otherwise. Is that correct? Okay. So then the challenge that I think would be the argument against this would be, what if you're wrong? And what if the government or the central planner or whoever it is making these laws actually knows better about your life, what would maximize your own wealth? For instance, I might want to, I might really like smoking cigars and lighting them with a $100 bill lit on fire. But a regulation that comes in that says that's illegal to burn money in order to light a cigar would actually maximize my wealth more than what I would have freely chosen.
Yeah, I mean, you really can't know, right, to begin with. The only thing you can know is what you value in that moment, and only you can know your own subjective valuations. No one else can know them. We can't measure subjective value. What you can do is perhaps imagine that you really wanted something else. Not in that moment, but after the fact, maybe you would be disappointed, or maybe you would have another goal or whatnot else, right? So if you would make it really hard to find desserts, for instance, you would help anyone on a diet. And after the fact, maybe people would go, oh yeah, I'm not as fat as I otherwise would have been, so this is good, right? But the thing is that in that moment, and that's the only way we can make decisions as human beings, right? We want to maximize the value in that moment. You're taking an option away from them. And it could also be the case, of course, especially in that case. I mean, very often retirement programs and things like that, retirement regulations are made on this basis that, people like to spend their money now and they don't think too much about the future. So what if we force them to save towards their retirement? Or maybe if even government taxes you to and then puts money into a retirement system that gives you a pension when you get old, assuming there is still money left and all this stuff. then we would have saved them, because otherwise they would have been poor. Yeah, potentially. But that's assuming that you know better than these people know about their own values. And very often it might be the case that they actually do value the present more highly than the future. And the future is always uncertain too. I mean, it could very well be that, well, you have money in your retirement savings account that the government forced you to put in there instead of enjoying life now, but you're dead in 5 years. Well, then you're not maximizing your value. There's no way you can. I mean, even if we would assume that the government knows better than you about your own valuations, which is just preposterous in itself, but even if we would grant that, the future is still uncertain. So it's still not the case that you can maximize. And the only way of doing this then is, as they also are doing, is to look at it on an aggregate level. That, people in general, or people, if we add them up into a population, they would be, well, you're so far away from actual valuations and people's personal subjective valuations when you add people's supposed values up and aggregate them for a country. That it's I don't even know why we would discuss this, because it's so preposterous in a sense, right? It's so far away from
basically
from
the larger scale you get, the more you compound the potential errors. And since the potential for error is already so large at the beginning, trying to project that into the future every step along the way, every second, minute, day, year, just amplifies the margin for error to the point where it's no longer even close to useful.
Right, and also note this: if you let everybody make their own errors, there's a learning effect, right? They learn from their errors, and they're going to do better next time. And they're going to make different errors. They can learn from each other. If you step in as a central planner for society, so say for 330 million people here in the U.S., you step in and say everybody needs to save this much for retirement. If that's the wrong choice, that's the wrong choice for 330 million people potentially, right? The scope and the magnitude of the error, or just the potential error, is enormous. Whereas if you would leave it to people themselves, or learn from each other, or be in groups or families, or whatever they choose, the magnitude of the error would be much smaller.
That makes sense. Well, that's a perfect segue into the unrealized, which I think is the most important key to this whole conversation, because that talks about the downstream effects. And I really like the example that you've used about the CDC banning touchscreens on devices. So let's get into that. Talk about what is the unrealized in light of everything that we've talked about.
Right. So the unrealized is basically what would happen if there was no regulations. So as you recall from the book, I produce a little society where people make all these choices, and they have these value scales and the rankings and things like that. And I work through the logic where they make these choices, and because they make these maximizing choices in a sense, right, at least according to their own valuations, they have all these different opportunities. And then they act on these opportunities. And of course, in any situation, we act on whatever is around us. If there's regulation, that's going to have not only an effect in the present on exactly that, but it's going to have ramifications further down the road too. So it's going to have ripple effects throughout the economy, which means opportunities are going to go away that would otherwise have been there.
Yeah.
So I think in the book there's someone choosing a different and better career because there is enough volume being produced by others in that industry. So she can pursue her dream job, and because that it produces value for others, everybody's better off, and she makes a whole lot of money, more money, and she's happier and all this stuff. But because there is regulation somewhere completely different, that's not happening, and she cannot pursue that dream of hers because there's the opportunity itself simply does not materialize. It's not realized. So One way of looking at this is simply that there are two different trajectories, right? The whole economy, that one is with the regulation, no one can choose this thing over here, whatever it might be. So they're staying away from that and instead choosing their second best, whatever that might be completely different things for everybody. And that's going to have effects throughout the economy. That's one trajectory. And whatever we're going to see as an outcome of that one, well, who knows? But it's going to be something. And the other trajectory is where the economy would have been had everybody been able to pursue their highest valuations instead. And it would necessarily have been higher because they changed their behavior because the highest valued option was taken away from them, right? So we know that this trajectory would be higher. The question is just how much higher, and how many of these opportunities for jobs and whatnot else are gone because people could not pursue this highest value.
It's hard to imagine in the future, hey, we've got all these regulations that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. I try and live my life the way I want, but I have to do certain things the way, I'm supposed to. It's hard to imagine what life would be like, let's say, in 50 years, 20 years, 100 years, if those things weren't happening. But I think it's easier to go back in time, look at, let's say, Henry Ford, and say if they were fighting climate change at that time and they banned the internal combustion engine, it's pretty easy to see, what would the downstream effects of that be for today? All the industries that would not have been created, all of the wealth creation, like all of that. And then try and pull that into the future and look at things that people cannot do today. I think it's easier once you take a step back in time.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, we should not forget that this is not as straightforward as it might seem. So you're absolutely right that if they would have done climate change or whatever, something that made the internal combustion engine never happen and the automobile never happened, well, we might not have had motorized transportation for quite some time. So society might not have developed as quickly. So anything that comes from there might not have happened. But also we would not have an oil industry, right? Which means we would not have plastics. Where would we be today without plastics? So I mean, all of these things, they fit together, right? And one affects the other. So the internal combustion engine, you might say, at least it's easy to dismiss it and say that, hey, well, without the internal combustion engine, we would just do some electric thing or something instead, and then we wouldn't have climate change or whatever. That's easy to say, but all these other things, I mean, there's plenty of development that has gone into not only engines, but in terms of the cars in general and safety measures and all these other things. All these investments would not have happened and might not have happened until later. But all these other things that happened, just like I mentioned, the plastics. Why would anyone have invented plastics? And plastics are made of oil. And if there is not an auto industry that runs on gasoline, why would we then drill for oil? Probably we wouldn't, which means that anything made out of oil or anything that we can use oil for today would not happen. Okay, well that means we would have to instead invent around those problems in some other way. Well, it's not clear, first of all, that we would be able to. Maybe we couldn't, so we would still suffer from all these things. I mean, one thing plastics, people don't like plastics either, right? Well, go into an emergency room. What would an emergency room look like without plastics? It simply wouldn't be there, right? Because anything that is that they're using is wrapped in layers and layers of plastic, and they're made out of plastic. So healthcare would be completely different too. So imagine if you would use needles and they would all be metal. They would need to be bigger to begin with. They might break. You would have to boil them between patients and whatever else. I mean, I have no clue what it would look like, of course. But all of these things, it's enormous. The ramifications of these things are enormous, even if the regulation seems like it's just a minor thing. The cost is pretty low. But if you look at the Unrealized, you realize that, oh my goodness, this is such a huge cost on society forever into the future, pretty much, that it's,
Right.
is it worth it? I mean, we should be really careful before we
Right.
impose
Yeah,
any
absolutely.
regulation.
The way that I like to visualize it is taking a river and putting a dam on that river and looking at, miles and miles down the road how the different ecosystems are changed and where the water ends up going and how everything completely changes. It's like if you look at one person's order of values, their list that they're pursuing, the top one's not available, so they go to the second one. That might not be a big change in the moment, might not have a huge impact, but the downstream effects of that and everything that impacts along the way are absolutely or potentially very, very large. And so we need to be very careful about the butterflies that we step on today, or should I say the butterflies that the government tells us to step on today because of the hurricanes that might cause in the future.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's just like you said, the economy is an ecosystem, and anything can affect something else. And since we're dealing with a process, and unfortunately, economists today they're thinking of the economy as basically a static system, as an equilibrium system, which makes it a whole lot easier to analyze. The issue though is that there are no issues in the present only. But if you look at it over time, you realize that it's a process, and it's a process that is made out of a lot of other processes, and these processes are interdependent, and they build off of and feed each other. So if you start meddling with it, you're going to end up with a lot of unintended consequences. And I mean, the argument of the book is that the most costly of those unintended consequences are the ones that we can't even observe because they're simply unrealized.
Well, this was fantastic. I really appreciate you spending the time here going through each of these issues, the seen, the unseen, what value is, what regulations are, and then how that impacts the downstream effects of that. Very valuable stuff. And for anybody who wants more, I highly suggest reading The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized. I'll have that link to the description below. And then also follow Per on Twitter. That's at PER. Is it underscore? Or is it at... What's your Twitter handle? Just your name.
Nope,
PERBYLUND. And I will have that
It's just a name
in the description below as well. Thank you so much for coming on today. All right.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.